Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya, a Rice News correspondent in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, good morning. Good morning, Dr. Reuben. Always the highlights of my morning, being able to hear your voice. Good morning, Rufai. Good morning, Vimbai. I hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all enjoying the warmth of being in each other's company. During the early hours of life here, of course, we're rather there in Lagos. We are, as you know, here on the streets of New York, and I'm going to take you around the world in terms of what is happening today. Well, let's start with, of course, the giant elephant in the room, which is UNGA. This is, again, moving into the middle part of high-level week, and we did have a lot to get through in terms of heads of state beginning their speeches at the general debate. But before we get into that, on the sidelines of UNGA, we were able to sit down with the CEO, the newly confirmed CEO of First Bank of Nigeria, Olusegun Alebiosu, and talk to him about what he had been participating in, which is a global leaders summit looking at impact and poverty eradication. Let's take a listen to what he had to say. Start with poverty there. It's definitely something that's very complex because we can talk about poverty in relative terms and poverty in absolute terms. We can talk about everyday types of poverty, but also financial poverty, a lack of access. Again, being that you're coming from an international impact perspective, focused on finance, what do you think is the type of poverty that you would seek to eradicate?
Oh, poverty in whichever form you see them, they're all symptoms of something. And so most times, poverty comes from lack of access and lack of resources. So whichever way you look at it, if you want to go to school and you're unable to finance it, it's same. If your parents are unable to raise the money, it's same. Okay, if you're unable to feed yourself, if you're unable to, if resources around you are not sufficient to actually advance your own interest, they all contribute to the same thing: capacity, capability, and access. And so to eradicate poverty, and of course, you know, we have, even in our country, have multidimensional poverty. And you do know that reality is that the most important factor of production in 21st century is finance. So whichever way you look at it, the easiest way to get people out of poverty is access to finance.
Alrighty there. So he was able to talk about how his position at the helm of First Bank of Nigeria, but also his position at the Global Leaders Summit on Tuesday, allowed him to understand better which areas of life he thinks that people with global influence should be focusing on, and one of them was poverty eradication. We'll play the full clip of that interview a little later on during our broadcasting today, perhaps with the Global Business Report at some point during the day. But let's crack on with the rest of our global brief. And as we know, President Biden, US President of the United States, that is, he did take to the stage at the UN General Debate in order to discuss and put out his own thoughts, his own positioning of the United States and how it relates with the rest of the world. This is, of course, his final UNGA appearance as US president. And he did also mention the politics of it all. But let's first start off with the real crux of his conversation, which really looks at different issues as it pertains to foreign policy. Of course, he talked about what is going on in the Middle East. He talked about Israel and, of course, Hamas. He did make clear, though, that while the United States continues to support Israel and its right to defend itself, he also acknowledged very, very clearly that what is going on in Gaza in terms of the humanitarian crisis is tantamount to hell. Those were his words. He says the people in Gaza are going through hell. So very, very strong words. But again, you have to back those words up with action if you want to be truly an independent and a broker that both sides would appreciate. Not only did he talk about what's going on in Palestine and with Hamas and Israel, he also talked about Israel's issues with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Just yesterday, we were talking about how Israel dropped airstrikes on Lebanon, which killed nearly 500 people. That was the single most deadliest strike in their latest iteration of the conflict between Israel and Lebanon, and targets from Hezbollah therein. So you can imagine that it does seem as though Israel have been able to show a lot of its military prowess in its issues with different countries in the Middle East. And it does seem as though it's getting to a point where escalations continue to rise. So definitely the US president discussed those issues there. But then he also moved on to talk about other international stories, looking at what is happening in Ukraine and Russia's invasion therein. He called Vladimir Putin a failure. He said that he had failed to destroy Ukraine and NATO as he had planned, and said and reiterated his belief that Ukraine will win this war, will win this invasion with Russia. So again, very, very strong words when you're looking at foreign policy and all of the issues taking place as all of these world leaders gather here in the United States, here in New York at UNGA. There's a huge, as you can imagine, because we have so many different heads of states and important, as we call them, people here at UNGA. You can imagine the road closures, the police presence. So it's very interesting to juxtapose that with what is going on at the meetings. A lot of conversations about how, if at all, these international powers can use their actual soft powers in order to bring Israel back from the brink, in order to calm down the aggression that they've been able to administer in different countries and targets across the Middle East. Moving away from what he discussed relating to foreign policy, he did also acknowledge that this would be the last time you'd see him on the stage at the general debate as president, and talked about how it is very important that his successor should be the correct choice, should be the choice that would be best for the United States. And moving on, definitely looking at the world. There are no prizes for guessing who he wants to replace him in office. But as it stands now, as we're all aware, it's still a very, very close fight. Despite what supporters on either side of the aisle may say, as we look ahead to the US election that will take place on the 5th of November, it does seem as though it is very, very close, and perhaps too close to tell even at now, which is why you can imagine President Biden made sure to mention and talk about who he would like to replace him and how that choice is imperative as we move away from his speech at the general debate. Moving on to some other stories taking place around the world, I did talk a little bit about the US election and definitely Trump too. We do know that just recently he had overcome and was protected from a second assassination attempt in 9 weeks. And now we do know that the person responsible, the suspect held in that case, has actually been charged with this criminality. US prosecutors, they have charged him. This is, of course, Ryan Wesley Routh, with these charges. He's 58 years old, and he will again begin this legal process in order to defend himself. It's not clear as it stands whether or not he has entered a plea, but we might be putting the cart before the horse. As it stands now, he has been formally charged, and if he is found guilty, once this does get to trial, he is likely already facing up to 20 years behind bars on 2 gun-related charges. If there is a maximum sentence attached here, if he is found guilty, then he does face life imprisonment. So it is very, very serious charges against Ryan Wesley Routh there, as he looks ahead to his legal battles with this attempted assassination of the former president of US, Donald Trump. I do also want us I will throw back to you for your comments now on UNGA, what you are looking forward to, which different heads of states you'll be looking forward to. As I said, they will be speaking over the course of the week. We do know that it kicked off as usual with Brazil just yesterday, and then followed on by by Joseph Robinette Biden, who took to the stage and of course delivered as I said, his last remarks as US President. And then as we look ahead to the rest of the week, there are a lot of different issues happening at UNGA this evening, or rather this afternoon, but evening time for you in Lagos, will be a Global Africa Business Initiative. They're calling it GABI, and it's going to bring together all of Nigeria and Africa's very notable figures and faces, and they will be delivering different types of speeches and also being able to share what ideas they have for UNGA. You know, when we look at the UN General Assembly, more than just heads of state taking to the stage and talking about their countries, there's a whole host of side events. And with Africa, there's definitely a huge focus on sustainability, on food security, on security in its most general terms. So we'll be taking you across with that. Love to hear your thoughts before we get into the newspapers.
I'll talk majorly on Biden's speech. Very underwhelming. As usual, he's not a great speaker. All the things we complain about with Biden still pretty much shows, you know, coordination, enunciation, very big problem. And also, yeah, but the good part of it is he showed us his journey since he was elected senator at the age of 29 in 1972. That's over 50 years ago, about 52 years ago, thereabouts. And all that he's gone through, his passion for his country. But one part he never admitted to was also the hypocrisy of America in this Israeli crisis. Now, they're saying, Biden is saying, oh, we want a ceasefire. Netanyahu should sign a ceasefire as much as possible and all of that. But you Americans, you emboldened Netanyahu. When all of this started, you kept on supporting him in the first place. I mean, we all act hypocritically in the world today, like we never even had leaders like Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister in Israel that sued for peace at every point he got the chance. I mean, this conflict was not supposed to even last close to a year now. But because Netanyahu wanted to use it to save his own political skin, continued, and he started looking for other people to drag into the conflict like he has done with Lebanon today. And the Americans kept on playing kid gloves and supporting this man. He has gotten what he wanted now. Likud is doing quite well in the polls now because he's attacking Lebanon. So I'm calling out the American hypocrisy in that speech. He should also account for that hypocrisy that emboldened people like Netanyahu.
Right. Now, the irony is not lost on me that at this gathering that is supposed to embody global diplomacy, cooperation, a spirit of peace, tensions are rife. The global tensions that are going on in every part of the world have been brought to this assembly, and it's filtering through in the majority of the speeches. Of course, yesterday, or rather in the early hours, my timeline is a bit of a blur because of the time difference, but of course, Iran's new president, that's Masoud Pezeshkian, spoke yesterday. Of course, there were protests going on outside, and he decided to address the protesters as opposed to addressing the leaders of the General Assembly. And in essence, what he said was, although we do have to acknowledge that his rhetoric is a little bit more gentle than we've seen from Iran in the past. However, he maintains a very defiant position, which is that there is no attack that will go unanswered by Iran. Again, quite a disappointing position in terms of war, you know, and the engagement in warfare on such a platform that is supposed to represent the opening up to diplomacy. But he wasn't alone. Even President Joe Biden, you know, we're hoping to see more of a diplomatic rhetoric, but, you know, standing defiantly by Ukraine, which we've seen the United States doing throughout. But again, we were all just hoping for sort of more peaceful and more unifying rhetoric. I believe Sergei Lavrov, who is a Russian foreign minister, has also been in attendance, although he hasn't spoken, of course, but he's also maintaining that the only way that the crisis between Russia and Ukraine can end is through more war, through the use of more warfare. So, you know, given that, and then lastly, the other speech that also took me away was South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is also reiterating that South Africa will stand by Palestine no matter what. So, you know, the spirit of defiance for me, sort of cancels out the mood and the spirit of what we're supposed to be seeing at the United Nations General Assembly and the call for reform to the Security Council in the hopes that the world can de-escalate from the tension environment that we're in now and look for a peaceful way to move forward.
Okay, Joe Biden, speaking for the last time as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. It was his farewell speech. Now, what are the key issues in his presentation? Apart from being the last time he would be on that platform, the key issues are as follows. One, he spoke about his decision to stand down. And he told the international community that, look, the country is more important than the party. And I think that that's a message, that other world leaders adapt forum of 193 member countries would take to heart. The second major point that he made was about Russia. And he said that he thinks that Russia will lose the war in Ukraine. And he called for support for Ukraine. That, again, I think against the background of geopolitics at this moment, is a very important point. The third point, major point that President Biden made for purposes of clarity and understanding is the crisis in the Middle East. And he was calling on the world community to say that, look, the world community, particularly the U.S., must not retreat in helping to resolve the crisis in the Middle East to ensure peace and stability. This summit, this 79th UNGA, is about Pact for the Future. The future cannot exist without peace and stability, and I think that's important.
We will be getting into the nitty-gritty of the Vice President's speech. I did want to make clear that we will be speaking, we're hoping to him tomorrow. We are in contact with the team and we're hoping that he'll be able to give us an exclusive tomorrow, which would be something that we discuss during the global brief on Thursday. But that being said, we will also get into the nitty-gritty of his speeches throughout the day, and also, just to clarify, hoping to get an exclusive one-on-one with him at some point tonight, which we will take very early on in the morning. Let's move on to our papers now. And this state newspaper, as you were mentioning beforehand, before coming over to me, leads with a lot of different stories, but also you do have the likes of comments from Goodluck Jonathan, who says that the Edo election is proof that technology at this point cannot solve Nigeria's electoral challenges. And then moving on to the New Telegraph now, it is also staying with the Edo elections and the fallout therein. It says that the fallout from this election has continued with accusations that the APC is plotting a one-party state. The US ambassador, the New Telegraph is reporting, also says it's monitoring the situation closely. And I can imagine that there will be many countries that will be monitoring the US election too. That being said, let's move on to the Daily Trust. And the Daily Trust looks like quite a controversial story this morning. It's looking at the firing or the dismissal of a female soldier. She was actually discharged from the Nigerian army after she accused an officer of sexual advances. Now, it's still quite a touchy subject. We do know that the Nigerian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Uju Kennedy, is on ground. We did speak to her yesterday, and had we been privy to this story, of course it broke after we would have been able to ask her on what she's doing about this situation, especially since, as it stands now, the Nigerian Ministry of Women's Affairs has not yet spoken out publicly about this issue with this soldier who's been discharged from the Nigerian army after making a report and a complaint about an officer, her senior, making sexual advances towards her. Moving on to The Punch now, and The Punch leads with the federal government may be needing to spend some 236 billion naira each month on imports and Dangote petrol. And there is still, as it stands now, calls for the subsidy removal and the issues surrounding that to be reinstated as this petrol pricing issue continues to dominate national discourse in Nigeria. And then lastly, bringing to the end of our Nigerian papers is the Daily Independent. It leads with the Senate President Godswill Akpabio saying that Nigerians are grappling with rising costs tell us something we do not know already. And he does go on to say that those changes are affecting the fabric of Nigerian society, and I can imagine that many people would agree with him. Let's take a look at the front page of the Daily Graphic in Ghana. And the Daily Graphic is leading with presidential posts being under scrutiny, and there have been calls for more transparency, especially when it looks for the appointments throughout the purview of the president. We did actually get to meet the Ghanaian president just yesterday evening, which has thrown a lot of our timings off, and we're hoping to get him to commit to an interview with us so that we can discuss his own political legacy and who he chooses or would like to replace him come December 7th, which is when Ghana goes to the general elections. And then when we move on to international papers now, The Guardian UK says Britain should keep the faith. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has, of course, been quite visible at the Labour Party conference, and he says that trade-offs and tough decisions will lead the UK out of the distraction of 14 years of Tory rule. So those are our papers there. Again, just looking at what we are looking at in terms of Nigeria and its presence at UNGA. As I said, we're hoping to speak to the Vice President one-on-one at some point this evening, which we will be able to hopefully take live very, very early in the morning into Thursday. But we do want to also reiterate the fact that the President and the Vice President have also called for debt forgiveness for Nigeria. It's something that took out the lion's share of his remarks today, calling for debt forgiveness and for other developing countries to have some sort of relief from international creditors so that the Global South can stand up and actually be able to be far more internationally competitive, be able to focus on different issues affecting their country without the burden of huge debt requirements, not just in Nigeria or in Africa, but indeed across the Global South here. So those are lots of issues that were taking place and spoken about at the UN General Assembly today. Again, we will be following and taking all of the different lines, and then hopefully being able to have a proper deep dive on Nigeria's presence the next time I speak to you.
It has to be said, this call for debt forgiveness reminds me of yesteryears. When Nigeria was calling for debt forgiveness, our debts were forgiven by the Paris Club, but we went back to those debts again. I think what the Nigerian state should be calling for is a level of fiscal discipline by our leaders. Not debt forgiveness. No matter how much they forgive Nigeria's debt, we will still go back to this scenario. Massive levels of corruption. I think it was back in the days when we were calling for debt forgiveness, and I think a British official was telling the Nigerian, a top official in Nigeria, that if only you know how much is in the bank account of Nigerians in the UK, it will pay off all your national debt. And most of those money are from corrupt sources. So let us stop deceiving ourselves.
Well, the other issue that we have to worry about also is the reform of the UN Security Council, which we are told that the Nigerian government is going to present in the national statement. It's an important point. When you bring the full report of the statement by Nigeria, you know, that will be something to look at. Thank you.